Hello and welcome. Welcome back to Deep Noetics. I think we're at episode 5, if I'm not mistaken. Today, we're going to talk about the origins of politics, the origins of the state, or even the deep state, as explained by Plato and Aristotle. We're going right back. We're going right back to the origins. And before I begin, I'd like to remind all of you to subscribe and to support my work on Substack. There's some articles coming soon on technology, on brain-computer interfaces, on the philosophy of neurotech. Also, if you would like to sign up for my course, I did a course on the philosophy of the machine, philosophy of technology. And there is an upcoming course on the philosophy of power, which is why I'll be speaking more about power in these live streams. So if you don't want to miss it, link is in the description. Remember to sign up. Also, there is a QR code you can scan to directly be sent to the page of the upcoming course. So remember, please support my work, support my Substack, sign up to my courses. All right, we're going right back. And as a little anecdote, when I first started getting into philosophy, I wanted to start right at the beginnings. And I looked it up, and turned out the beginnings were with Thales, the first philosopher we really know of, at least in ancient Greece. There's obviously older philosophies from India. We've got the Upanishads and other similar works. But the oldest work that is like a comprehensive treatise on philosophy is Plato's Republic. And incidentally, it is a work on politics. It is a work on political power, on the state, on the forms of government. And the reason why I'm saying why in the title or in the thumbnail I'm speaking of a deep state is that I am going into the notion of the state, or the republic, as a metaphysical one, as one that pertains to the human spirit, as Plato has it, and thus is something that is inherent to man. It is inherent to humanity, and thus persists regardless of the surface appearance that a political structure may give off. So even if you have different forms in which politics, or in which a state can be arranged and shows itself, the core will always follow a particular structure, and that core may be difficult to assess because of illusion, because of delusions and distortions of its outward appearance. Very much in the vein of Plato's allegory of the cave, we have a world of appearances that we need to pierce through to arrive at the fundamental underlying essence that lies at the bottom of those appearances. And in the same sense, the colloquial internet understanding of the notion of the deep state is that there are deluding, distorting appearances, for example, appearances of a political game, appearances of a political spectacle between the left and the right, or other dynamics, whilst in reality, the core, the mysterious unity of power remains the same. And that is what is in a philosophical sense meant by the notion of something like a deep state. And similarly, we can understand it as a fundamental reality of government, a metaphysical core, a metaphysical archetypal structure, a metaphysical, you could say, standard template of power that you can find in any power structure, only that these power structures may be corrupted, or some more benign, some less benign, and may show themselves in different configurations. So Plato and Aristotle obviously were not the same. Aristotle famously disagreed with Plato on many fronts. But we will see that in their core, they were both Greek thinkers. In their core, they still have a lot of similarities, especially when we focus on the state, when we focus on government and a philosophical understanding of power. Now, Plato begins with an analogy between man and society. In the same way as society, or in the same way as man can be separated into three spheres, society is separated into three spheres. These separations have been done in different ways and have been translated in different ways from Greek texts, from original Platonic texts. Therefore, it can cause some confusion if you try to name them, especially as different translations use different words. Obviously, ideally, we should all know ancient Greek. I admittedly am not very proficient in it. I do learn the etymological origins of certain words, but I am not reading entire texts in ancient Greek. So you can imagine the structure, the tripartite structure of man, as determined by either the body, the soul, and the spirit, or by desire, by spirit, and by reason. The first characterization pertains kind of more to metaphysical essences. The body is material, the soul is emotional, or you could say aspirational, ambitious, and the spirit is rational. The spirit can discern truth. The spirit can attain wisdom. In a similar sense, desire is something that is tied to the body. If we take the second set of translations, desire is something that pertains to appetites of the physical body, whilst the spirit, and so we get the confusion here. In the first scheme, you've got the body, the soul, the spirit, and the second, the spirit is on the second plane. So be careful here. You get a confusion here in these terms. However, what they're trying to convey is the same thing. The lowest level is that of desire in the one hand, or that of body on the other, which is conveying a striving for pleasure. A striving for pleasure, but also for material gain, as the body's material. The nature of what is desired is material. It's bodily pleasure, and it is material wealth. Very basically put, as we probably know it in our everyday lives, it is sex and money, right? On the next level, which is translated in the one hand as spirit, and in the other as the soul, you've got the ambitious spirit. You've got the striving, the desire, you could say, for virtue, for honor, for recognition. Something that lasts beyond your death. Something that is like a wave you put in motion in the life you lead, in the virtuous life you lead, which lasts beyond, which carries on after the body perishes. And if you come to the highest level, which in the first form of translation would be the spirit, and the second would be reason, you get that which is eternal. You get that which not only persists beyond your body, beyond your physical life, beyond your physical death, but actually lasts forever. It lasts forever in the sense that it was already there before your birth and will always be there after your death. It is eternal truth. It is the eternal idea of the good. It is the eternal oneness of all. Now, these three levels that we've identified in man, that we've identified in the human essence, they correspond to levels within society. They correspond to levels within the polis. So the polis Another problematic term, because we've got politeia in the original Greek, which is translated in English into the Republic and in German into der Staat, meaning the state. I'd prefer the German translation, as it speaks of the state as a pure, you could say, almost cybernetic. You could say cybernetics began in that sense, where you started looking at politics as a science of societal control. It is a steering of a political entity, a political unity that is represented by a society. A state thus remains relatively abstract and agnostic, you could say, about its constellation and what kind of forms of government or what kind of political process it exhibits. Whereas the republic, if you use the term republic to translate it, it may not be incorrect in the technical sense. However, it does carry a certain modern baggage, where you would assume intuitively that Plato's speaking of some form of liberal democracy, which he is certainly not. So now, each of these three spheres of human essence, as I said, correspond to a level in society. Each of them correspond to a level in society. At the base level, we get what we commonly understand: the citizens, the craftsmen, the farmers, those that engage in physical labor to sustain their existence, physical labor to sustain their livelihood. This physical labor, as corresponding to the body and physical desires, is exerted to maintain the material means of existence, meaning to gain material wealth, to sustain a family and reproduce. It is the necessary but lowest part of the human soul, corresponding to the necessary but lowest part of the human society. Now, on the next level, we've got the soul, the ambitious desire, the spirit, which corresponds to the second level in society. And just as the human aspect strives for virtue, for honor, for duty, something that goes beyond the physical death, you have that in society represented by the guardians. The guardians, as Plato puts it, being a class that maintains the society as it is. They are the guardians of the polis. They are the guardians of the state, the politeia. And lastly, you've got the highest sphere, represented by reason, represented by that which is eternal, and that obviously needs to correspond to the highest level in society, which are the philosopher kings, the council of the wisest and smartest, the philosophos, the lovers of wisdom. This entire society is rigidly top-down. It's rigidly hierarchical. Now, whilst and also it strictly separates the desires. Whilst the lowest level of desire is strictly reserved for the lowest class, it is strictly reserved for the citizens, for the craftsmen and the farmers. They are permitted to engage in trade in a market and become rich through trade and through labor, whilst the guardians are exclusively there to be virtuous, to be honorable, and to follow their duty. And in that sense, they are not even permitted to engage in the physical labor and the physical work that it takes to attain riches, to attain material wealth. they are not permitted, and therefore they're not permitted to own personal possessions, to own private property. Private property may be a bit of an anachronism, as private property arguably is something of a modern industrial age. However, they are not permitted to own any of this. They share all of their possessions among the guardians, and therefore regard each other as one commune, as one entity, and have a superior solidarity with each other. And lastly, the philosopher kings, they have a supreme control over the entire society. The supreme control up to the part that they decide who is matched up with who to marry and have children, procreate with in the entire state. It is seemingly done by chance. People pick at random their partner, but that chance is controlled behind the scenes by the philosopher kings to manage the next generation and essentially engage in a form of selective breeding and eugenics in order to improve and optimize the livestock of the society. Now, the specifics of what each of these three castes do, these three classes do, is specific to Plato and his description. However, we can see that he is actually addressing a sort of metaphysical core that all of hierarchical societies seem to fulfill. Looking at the Hindu caste system, for example, we get a similar structure. We get a similar structure, even though they were not necessarily inspired by Plato, as Plato had written that way later, way after the emergence of the caste system. Arguably, Plato even got inspired to write his system and to develop a system the way it is by studying other societies, such as the Hindus. And there you have a similar situation. You've got the highest caste being something like the Brahmins, the priesthood of Brahma, those who are exclusively capable to directly engage in the contemplation of the one, as Plato would put it, or Brahma, as the Hindu tradition would put it. After which you get Kshatriya, warriors. I hope I'm not mixing up the terms. I don't want to be incorrect about this. Yeah, and then on the lowest level, you get the Vaishyas, the peasants and merchants. And below that, you have the Shudras and the untouchables below that. So there's a few more layers there. All right. Now, we need to look at the particular way in which power is exerted within one of these structures. It is obviously an artificial separation to look at these levels individually, to only look at the lowest level and then only look at the central level, because all of them have an interplay in reality. The pure ideal state as Plato developed it obviously doesn't exist in that form. But if we start isolating them and looking at individual strata there, we can look at how power is exerted within them. So imagine it was only that stratum, or imagine that one took control over this whole society. Then we have a particular dynamic at play. With the philosopher kings, we've got the rule of very, very few, if not the rule of one, if there is a supreme philosopher. With the rule of the warriors, of the guardians, you get the rule of the few. And with the rule of the merchants and peasants and farmers, you get the rule of the many. And all of these have very old terms that we should be familiar with to some extent. We have on top the monarchy, below that aristocracy, and below that, democracy. And each of these forms are, in Plato, seen as inseparable from a coherent whole in which the right kind of monarchy is on top, the right kind of aristocracy is below it, and the right kind of democracy is below that. Democracy in a total sense, that all of it is ruled by the masses, is explicitly rejected by Plato, especially since they voted on executing Socrates, Plato's teacher, former mentor, and according to Plato, but many more people, the wisest man to have ever lived. And if the wisest man to have ever lived is killed by a popular vote, then democracy is officially disproven in Plato's view. Aristotle sees these things a little bit differently. He regards each of those three forms to have a benign and a degenerate form, a good form and a corrupted version. For example, if we take monarchy, the benign form is that of a benign king. Monarchy can be a good form of government if you have a benign king, a healthy royal family that maintains the integrity of the state and maintains the traditions of the state. However, a degenerate form of monarchy would be if the monarch exploits the state exclusively for his personal gain, and that is, by definition, then a tyranny. It is no longer the benign form, it is no longer the monarchy, but it is the tyranny. Going over to the aristocracy, the benign form is the aristocracy of a nobility, of a noble few, the rule of a noble few, a minority that sticks to noble principles, that sticks to high cultural principles. For example, maintain the prevalence and promote the proliferation of high art, of beauty within society, that have a certain common aesthetic, a common goal that drives the society to flourish. On the degenerate front, you get oligarchy, which is again the few exploiting the society for their own gain. The few exploiting it for their own gain often happens economically, happens through exploitative means, using self-enrichment. And that way you get the degenerate form of the aristocracy, namely the oligarchy. And arguably a lot of modern debates about capitalism, about communism, all boil down to a rejection of a particular kind of aristocracy, as they are identified as a corrupt oligarchy, essentially the tyranny of the few rather than the tyranny of the one. On the lowest level, Plato and Aristotle kind of agree. There is no benign democracy. Democracy in itself is the degenerate form, namely the rule of the masses, the rule of the peasants, and therefore a reduction of society to the lowest common denominator. It is a tearing down and a disintegration of society into the particular fractions of the mobilized masses and the emotional and radicalized mob. Even though democracy is positively connotated nowadays, we do see harsh critics and harsh criticisms in public media about so-called populism, about so-called demagoguery, about so-called incitement, which is essentially when the democratic process becomes too hot, when it becomes too active, and arguably you could say if it becomes too democratic in the original sense of what democratic would mean. And the benign form, though, there is a benign form in Aristotle at least. not so much with Plato. The benign form would just call a constitution, and this is again what inspired forms of government such as modern Britain or the United States. The constitution, namely, maintains all of the spheres. It maintains a sphere of the rule of one, a sphere of the rule of a few, and a sphere of the rule of the many, and keeps them coherent in a process. And that is essentially what a constitutional state does. You have that, you can see it in Britain as well as the United States, where you have a place for the rule of the many, namely a House of Commons in Britain or a lower house of Congress in the United States. You have in aristocracy, you have an institutionalized aristocracy given by the House of Lords in the UK and the Senate in the United States. And then you also got a monarchy encoded in the Constitution, which is the presidency in the United States, or the crown, the actual monarch in the United Kingdom. These are some examples that date back and were perhaps represented in a more original form in ancient Rome, where you've got the tribunals being run by the masses, by the people, that are being a democratic institution. You've got the occasional people's tribune that would rise up to become dictator for 6 months if the republic was in crisis. Most famously, people's tribune that prepared the way to the first Caesar was Sulla in his feuds with Marius leading up to Caesar's time in the first century BC. Also, you've got the aristocratic institution of the Senate in ancient Rome that was set up of an aristocracy specially derived from the legions, from the military. People that were appointed to the Senate would have gone through various cultus honorums, various procedures and initiation levels, various, you could say, promotion cycles in the Roman army and the Roman administration of the realm. And lastly, finally, in the rise of Caesar and Caesarianism, you have the full establishment of a monarchy of a single ruler, which could be benign, as famously attributed to Augustus or Marcus Aurelius, or can be tyrannical, as famously attributed to Nero or Caligula. So, now, following this, we've got the benign versions and we've got the degenerate versions of the 3 forms of government. The 3 forms that correspond to the rule of the one, the few, and the many. Each of those corresponding within Plato's framework to, at the same time, a level of the human essence and also a level of the polis, of the human society. Now, on top of this, as a final chapter, I'd like to talk about the cycle of civilizations of the state that Plato describes, as he actually describes his own relationship between these different states of government. And that relationship, as opposed to a conceptual one that we've spoken of thus far, that relationship is actually also a temporal one. It is a kind of dynamic, you could say it is a historical dynamic of how these play out. So let me turn on the light. I've done a terrible job with the green screen today. So before I move on to the Platonic cycle of the state, I'd like to remind you to leave a like and subscribe to my channel and support my work on Substack. I'll be publishing there this week, next week. And also sign up to my courses, Philosophy of the Machine and Philosophy of Power. All the links are in the description. So, Now, let me just quickly fix this. There we go. This is better. Okay. So, Plato, interestingly, makes a truly cybernetic argument if you think about it. He makes a truly, you could almost say, dynamical or thermodynamical argument, one of entropy, where you say a closed system can only transition from a state of high order, of high cohesion, into one of disorder, but never the other way around. Similar to how an ice cube can only melt into an equilibrium in a glass of water, rather than the glass of water spontaneously separating into a cold and a warm region. You have a kind of natural dissipation process in a way that is similar to how Plato describes it for societies. What do I mean by that? Is you begin with a noble aristocracy. You begin with a noble aristocracy, and then you naturally disintegrate into an oligarchy. The degenerate form of the aristocracy, namely the oligarchy, is what naturally occurs following a certain historical process in which at some point the aristocracy no longer maintains its higher ideals and mainly works for its own benefit. The reason why this happens is one of, you could say, pure dynamics or pure statistics, you could say, because let's assume you have 10 noble aristocracies and one ignoble, non-noble aristocracy. These, as soon as you hit one, you won't go back. The dynamic, it is almost like a feedback. The dynamic of a degenerate aristocracy is very hard to reverse, and thus, as soon as there's one that is no longer noble, which by pure chance may happen, then it will start the disintegration process. An oligarchy cannot maintain itself, as it will increase the resentment of the people against it. That is, in a sense, the Marxist argument that naturally an oligarchy of capitalists that maintain a system of production that only serves their personal gain necessitates the rise of a resentful working class. Going back to the origins of this, going back to Plato, you have the masses necessarily becoming resentful to such an oligarchy and taking it down. And whatever, imprisoning, executing that oligarchy and taking power into its own hands. Now, this power is only one of exploitation. The masses, by their very nature, cannot restrain themselves, as they are driven by pure physical bodily desires, according to Plato, and thus will essentially disintegrate and basically take its own share of the loot that was initially only there for the oligarchy. It will start taking its own share of the loot, and once it's divided up, not only among a minority but by a majority, this will quickly dissipate. The state will disintegrate into anarchy. Anarchy being a state that is identical. The two extremes meet. You have a cycle in Plato. Anarchy being identical to tyranny, and as anarchy can only last for, let's say, 1 second until a brutal tyrant forces a certain order into the masses. It could be also an invading force from somewhere else, from the external side, and the cycle can recontinue as the tyranny and the anarchy sustains itself. And you get the reverse argument, the reverse probabilistic argument, you could say, until incidentally one of the tyrants is a benign monarch and establishes a new aristocracy as its own royal court, and you begin with a benign aristocracy once again. And the cycle has been closed. So you get that interesting cycle that you don't necessarily get with Aristotle, namely where the lowest part, the tyranny, is identified with a corrupt version of the highest level being the lowest part, the anarchy, being identified with the degenerate form of the highest level, namely the tyranny, and thus initiating a re-emergence, a re-beginning, a new beginning of this cycle of the cyclical behavior. So this has been everything for today. If you have any questions, as always, you can leave them in the chat. I haven't seen any questions today. And I will be up for another stream either this week or next week. So this is a regular process. Keep in mind to support my work, leave a like, subscribe, share this video, share this series when anyone would be interested, support my work on Substack, and I will see you next time. Thank you very, very much for your attention. I appreciate it. Bye.